Far More Than We Think, Making Sense of Spirituality by Angelo. Chapter 58, Irreverent Reverence. Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and all other religions or belief systems in the world have one thing in common. They each believe that they have all of the answers and that the others must therefore be wrong in some way. Along my own journey, I'm trying to develop an understanding of spirituality that makes sense of the multitude of differing beliefs without having to accept or reject any of them. I should qualify this chapter more than any other, because here I will be expressing views that most certainly will not be universally welcomed. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm not allied to any religion or sect. I have no wish to cause offence, so please consider these paragraphs as simply an attempt to make sense of the multitude of differing opinions and beliefs. Focusing on the monotheistic religions that seem to be the root of so much antagonism, I was surprised to discover that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all have their foundations in the Old Testament of the Bible. Having read the Old Testament and recently been lucky enough to travel to the Middle East and visit many of the sites mentioned therein, my own view is that much of what is recorded in the sacred texts is probably based on real events. It's quite plausible to me that the likes of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses and Elijah and the others did have genuine spiritual experiences, and that many of the stories are largely true. There's also geological evidence that much of the area described in the Bible was once underwater, which gives credence to the idea of a great flood. The major issue for me is the chronology of the Old Testament, which contains precise genealogy all the way back to Adam and Eve, and hence the story of Genesis. Applying sensible life expectancies to the multiple generations of ancestors, we arrive at a period some 6,000 years ago, for when Adam was reputed to have been alive. This contrasts with archaeological evidence of local human settlements in Jericho at least 12,000 years ago, and even more sharply with the earliest traces of anatomically modern humans found so far that date back approximately 195,000 years. Adam may have existed, but he can only have been the patriarch of a particular tribe of human beings, rather than anything more significant. This, for me, places the whole of the Bible in the context of the spiritual experiences of one specific group of people, and not humanity as a whole. The wisdom may be important, but it does not by any means have to be the whole story. The Old Testament prophesies the coming of a Messiah, which Christianity claims to be Jesus. Islam acknowledges Jesus as a prophet, but focuses on the Quran as revealed by the Prophet Muhammad some 600 years later. And Judaism continues to await its Messiah. As well as these core differences, there are multiple denominations within each of the faiths that render the whole landscape totally bewildering. We are all acutely aware of the bloody conflicts which have ensued and which continue to this day. Each new generation is indoctrinated into its own version of the truth and its own version of history, and hence religious instability lives on. Spiritual principles are supposedly a core part of each religion, but seem to be quickly forgotten when ideologies clash. When I first became aware of my spirituality, I was initially attracted to the Christian church. The people involved were very welcoming, and the theology was interesting and compelling. The church services were spiritually uplifting and enjoyable, and the sermons and Bible classes were instructive and thought-provoking. The Christian fellowship has many positive aspects and does a great deal of good work. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Jesus really did exist, and that he was an incredibly spiritual man. There is documentary evidence in the Gospels that he performed his healings and other miracles, and, as we've seen, such metaphysical phenomena are now beginning to become plausible from a scientific point of view. Yeshua of Nazareth clearly made a big impact. He became known as Jesus Christ, and his allotted name and reputation spawned a religion. The key issue for me is the Christian claim that Jesus was the singular Son of God. And interestingly, the Roman Emperor at the time, Caesar Augustus, claimed himself to be the Son of God, courtesy of being posthumously adopted by Julius Caesar, who was the first Roman emperor to declare himself divine. A rival Jewish Son of God would certainly have been politically convenient at the time in the Holy Land. I see the life of Jesus as an example of a deeply spiritual experience, with his claim to be the Son of God as being representative of humankind by dint of his connection to all other human beings through the common source. He was, if you like, claiming to be humanity personified. He believed and portrayed himself as humankind in order to emphasize and make real the spiritual wisdom that he was trying to impart. Christians tend to believe that the only way to God is through Jesus. That has not been my personal experience, or the experience of countless millions of others. Perhaps it might be more accurate to say that Jesus is one of the many ways to God. The religion seems to revere the messenger more than the messages he taught. If we use the words from the previous chapter and conclude that each of our individual spirits is the Christ within, what we can say is that the way to God is through Christ. This is the same thing as saying, for example, that the way to access the universal energy of life is through our own inner spirituality. This, for me, is crucially important and highlights how specific words can cause so much confusion. The real message is perhaps that the way to freedom is through salvation from our own egos. The suffering on the cross was almost certainly real, but it was also symbolic of the suffering of humankind in its obsession with the original sin of ego self. Forgiveness of that sin, or mistake, is the way to salvation. The resurrection is not necessarily implausible from a quantum physics point of view, and can also be seen as representing the rebirth of humankind once we die to the idea that we are separate from all that is. It does make sense from a broader perspective, but it's also easy to get lost in the detail. My own cursory exploration of religion has led me to conclude that no religion has a monopoly on the truth. They all have a particular view, but each is too insular to see the broader picture. Each religion seems to have created an ego for itself that prevents it from unconditionally accepting and embracing all others. Spirituality, as I understand it, takes a broader perspective than religion. No religion is likely to welcome the irreverent spiritual principles that I've outlined, whereas spirituality can easily accommodate any religion. There is much wisdom in religion, but while religion needs and relies upon spirituality in order to justify itself, spirituality does not need religion. It may well be that all the major religions of the world started out with the purest of ideals and concepts, but somehow have been polluted by the ego of humankind and have lost their way. Religion, power, politics and money create a volatile cocktail that dilutes spiritual principles. The opulence of religious institutions, the rigid doctrines, the hierarchies of officials, the intolerance and the fanaticism of individuals and groups are all distasteful aspects of religion, and ironically can be seen as non-spiritual. The Church was surely intended to be a spiritual family of consciousness, and not a man-made institution with an ego of its own. When we see things from this perspective, it's deeply saddening to reflect that humankind has been arguing and fighting about religion all this time. Countless millions of deaths and acts of barbarism have been committed in the name of religion. So much destruction and suffering has taken place, all to impose a particular religious view. The notion that one version of God is better than any other can only derive from ego. Everyone is talking about the same thing, but using different words and figureheads. If we are all one, then we don't really need religion. All we need to do is wake up to our own individual spirituality in whichever way we choose. There have been innumerable spiritual masters, and many of them have spawned separate religions. There are similarities and overlaps amongst them, but each religion stands alone in believing it has its own particular set of answers. I could spend a lifetime exploring each of them in detail, but I ultimately suspect that they all will lead back to the same place. I prefer a broad model of spirituality that makes sense of all that I see and experience in the world, and which does not require me to join any particular tribe. The only tribe that I can relate to is the one that comprises all of humanity and the natural world as one universal living being. Any subdivision of that oneness creates the conditions for separation, disagreement, conflict, fear, and suffering. There's no need to join any tribe other than oneness. If we were to take the loyalty, commitment and passion that we have for our existing tribes and apply it on an increasingly broad basis, there would eventually be nobody left to disagree with or compete with, because we would all be on the same side. This sounds like an impossible dream, given where we are today, and it seems that humankind is doomed to self-destruct. There's no way the world can unite behind a single religion, political party, or national identification. There's no hope of a lasting top-down solution to any of the world's problems, because there are too many ingrained and competing interests. The only hope for any kind of solution to our many challenges would be through a bottom-up approach that would infer the collective enlightenment of humankind. We would need to awaken one by one until there was enough momentum to bring about the massive change needed. This may happen one day, but it's not something any of us can force. Meanwhile, what we can do is focus on ourselves, bring about our own enlightenment, and gently encourage others to do the same through our words and actions. There are many more people trying to do this than we may realize, but much of it goes unnoticed by society at large. It's not a question of switching tribes or giving up on our core beliefs or allegiances. All we need to do is raise our perspective to see that there is a bigger tribe to which we all belong. Celtic and Rangers fans both relate strongly to the city of Glasgow. Catholics and Protestants both relate strongly to the Christian faith. Islam, Judaism and Christianity all relate to the Old Testament and worship a monotheistic God. It's when we focus on our similarities rather than our differences that harmony and mutual respect can thrive. Fear can be replaced by love as soon as we see that we're all on the same team. Enemies can quickly become brothers when united by a common purpose. If we imagine Earth as a living being comprised of its billions and billions of parts, including us, then my view would be that the being is in pretty poor health. Instead of working together, the parts of the being are fighting amongst themselves for some artificial notion of supremacy. The being is like an alcoholic who is slowly poisoning himself. He knows his behaviour is destructive and that it will almost certainly eventually kill him, but still he can't stop. He's addicted to his drug of choice, and it still gives him some illusory comfort despite the obvious pain and chaos. He's fearful of being without his crutch and would rather carry on to the bitter end than give it up. Then things get so bad that he seeks help. It transpires that the solution to alcoholism is a spiritual awakening. The illness does not ever go away, but a spiritual way of life keeps him safe from picking up a drink and restarting the whole downward spiral again. I speak from personal experience because this is exactly what happened to me. I've experienced the hellish downward spiral of addiction and the salvation of spiritual recovery. Collective ego can be seen as the drug of choice for humankind. We are addicted to it and cannot conceive of ever giving it up. We believe it's impossible to live without it. Life would be miserable and not worth living if it were denied us. We will hold on to it until the bitter end if we have to. Just like alcohol poisons the alcoholic, so the collective ego of humankind is slowly poisoning the living being. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, the addict remains in denial and aggressively rejects or denies any suggestion that he has a problem. If he does accept that there is a problem, he will perhaps try to stop his addiction by himself, but all efforts are futile. He continues his destructive behaviour, even though things get worse and worse. The progressive illness eats away at his personal standards. What used to be unacceptable becomes acceptable in the face of an increasing need for his drug. Morals disappear, desperation sets in, and chaos ensues. The potential outcomes are now limited. Either the alcoholic will commit suicide or die a slow and painful death as his body and mind deteriorate, or something miraculous will happen to bring about change. For many alcoholics, the suffering becomes so unbearable that they cry out for help. It's from this devastatingly low point that a recovery can begin, and eventually a spiritual awakening comes about as a result of suggested actions. Often a recovered alcoholic will look back and wonder how on earth it took him so long to realize and accept the potentially fatal nature of his condition. The signs had been there for many years, yet he managed to ignore or deny them. Such is the power of addiction. It kills unless it is arrested by spiritual principles. The collective ego of humankind is comprised of each of us, together with the egos of nations, religions, institutions, corporations, organizations, and affiliations of all types. Ego impacts every aspect of our lives and is the underlying, all-pervasive problem we face. It can only be arrested piece by piece, one ego at a time, through spiritual practice. Either we will recover in time, or we will most probably self-destruct. It's a pretty stark situation, yet not many people seem to be making the spiritual choice. Perhaps things have not yet got bad enough. Maybe we are waiting for something more catastrophic to happen. Sadly, the only prospect is for more suffering on an individual and a collective basis. More suffering is inevitable unless we change. The addiction to ego will keep hurting us until we let it go. If enough momentum could be built for spirituality to be seen as the solution to our problems, then the tide would gradually turn. It would eventually be the egomaniacs that stand out from the crowd, rather than the spiritual people. This is the only alternative that I can see to the path of self-destruction we are currently on. The collective ego has the ability to let go of its hold on us, but only if each individual chooses to do so. We should consider this carefully, if not for our own sake, then for the sake of our children and grandchildren. In this respect, each of us is personally responsible for the ultimate fate of humankind. We are all one. We tend to believe everyone else is the problem, but in truth, we are the masters of our own destiny. Selfless, unconditional love could heal the world. We don't have to wait for others to take the plunge first. We are all free to choose what we believe, and we have no need to judge each other as right or wrong. We can all choose our own path of spiritual growth. There's no correct or incorrect path, but we often forget that we are actually all on the same journey. If all religions could see that God is universal, and that none of them has a monopoly on spiritual belief or practice, the world would clearly be a far more peaceful place. Religions claim ownership of God for their own purpose, yet it's obvious to anyone with a broad spiritual perspective that the universal energy of life belongs to everyone and is everyone and everything. There is no distinction or ownership. Any religion that claims precedence for its own doctrines and practices over any other must be acting from ego rather than love. I'm not referring just to religious fanaticism, but to all who believe their religion to be sacrosanct. Any religion that claims to have all of the answers is itself a big part of the problem. Organized religion is not really helpful for the unity of humankind. There is no conflict between science and religion, and there's no justifiable spiritual basis for conflict between any of the religions. Everyone is saying the same thing, but using different words. Spirituality, in its broadest sense, is the unifying view that brings all competing ideologies together. Spirituality makes sense of religion, but religion makes no sense on its own. The wise person is but a vessel of wisdom, and he knows that he does not know best. Many religious leaders and teachers have perhaps yet to see this fundamental spiritual truth. Life loves diversity, and nobody is right or can claim to be right. Humility is a virtue, and we could all certainly do with more of it, including me, much of the time. I still have a long way to go, but my current understanding, experience and belief are that God is both within and without. Countless sages throughout the millennia have told us in innumerable ways that the path to conscious awareness of God is to access our own spiritual selves through regular practice. This may sound like irreverent reverence, but for me that means any and all forms of spiritual practice are equally valid. We can each choose our own way, but that must mean everyone else is free to choose for themselves too. Consequently, there can be no right or wrong way. Righteousness is not necessary, because none of us can really capture the omnipotent, omniscient, indescribable underlying reality that we use so many different words to try to describe and define. All we can do is experience it in our own way and be eternally grateful.